The difference between a successful farm and a failed one can often be the quality of the hired help. And when you're hiring hands, there are some legal issues you need to consider. So we've asked our friend Shannon Ferrell to put on his lawyer suit and come talk to us about the legal side of hiring folks. And these are important issues.
Absolutely. There are lots of rules that no matter how big or small you are, you need to make sure you follow. And the first one of those is that even if you have only one employee, you need to make sure that you fill out a Form I-9 for that employee.
Okay.
Now, with all of the furor that's been going through the national media about immigration law, I-9 is really important because I-9 documents that a worker is eligible to work in the United States. It's actually really simple. It's a one-page form that both the employee and the employer fill out together. Now, the employee will fill out their personal information, and then they'll present identification documents to the employer, and the employer has to review those documents and figure out whether or not they're accurate. Now, you can fill out just one document. You can just have a U.S. passport. That's kind of the gold standard, and that will suffice. But if you don't have a passport or one of those kinds of documents, you'll need to have a document that shows the identity of the person, and typically that's a driver's license or some other government-issued photo ID, and a different document that shows that the person's eligible to work. And again, the go-to document there is a Social Security card. So one of each of those will document that person is eligible to work in the U.S.
All right, now most of our farmers aren't document experts. What's the standard for what those things have to be considered at?
You don't have to do a CSI analysis on these documents to figure out if they're genuine or not. You basically just have to use your eyeball test. If a reasonable person would think that this document looks genuine and that it relates to the person that gave it to me, that's good enough.
Very good. Now let's talk a little bit about wages and hours, because those are, of course, issues that we don't think about so much in farms. We tend to go a little longer in the day. First of all, what do we have to pay folks? And then how long can we let them work? Do we have to worry about overtime? All of those things.
We don't tend to think that the farm day starts and ends at any point. It's just always ongoing. But the labor laws think differently. So one thing that we always have to be thinking about is the minimum wage. Now, right now, the minimum wage in Oklahoma and across the U.S. is $7.25 an hour. So that's what we have to pay our workers unless there's an exception. And there are some exceptions in agriculture. For farms that are very small and have a very small number of employees, there's an exemption there. If you are the spouse or child of the employer, you're exempt from that, as all of us farm kids know. There is an exemption for people that pick crops on a piece rate basis because their pay is defined on their rate of work versus their hours. And then there's also an exception for the range production of livestock. Now, most people say, okay, well, I produce cattle on range, but that's not really what this regulation means. If you read the interpretations of this rule by the department, what they're saying is that if we're talking about a huge operation where it would be virtually impossible to come back to headquarters every night, and it'd be virtually impossible for us to know how many hours we worked.
Something like the King Ranch, one of those big places.
Exactly. A big open range kind of production is what that exemption's for.
Okay. Now, one thing you mentioned in there is the kids of the farmer. There's been a lot of uproar lately, a lot of stuff we're hearing in the media. I guess there's some proposed changes to child labor laws. Can you kind of break down what's really going on there?
Sure. And this is kind of a modification of an already existing rule. Okay. Basically, the rule is that for most industries, if there's a task that's deemed quote unquote hazardous by the Department of Labor, a child under the age of 18 can't do that. Well, in agriculture, it's different. We have a 16-year rule. And by the way, if you're the child of the person that's owning or operating the particular facility, you're exempt from that requirement. So you can still engage in those activities even if you are under the age of 16.
Okay. Now let's talk about some of these changes that they're proposing. I guess some of the highlights for those.
And if you really wanted to kind of sum how this all works, they're basically proposing a little bit more strict standard for these hazardous activities. For example, the current rule says that a child under the age of 16 can't operate a tractor if it's got more than 20 horsepower measured at the PTO. The new rule would say no lower limit on the tractor. Any tractor would be within the rule. The rule right now says there are very specific types of power equipment that can't be operated. The new rule would say any kind of power equipment. The rule right now lists very specific kinds of facilities that a minor can't enter into, things like grain silos of certain types, silage storage facilities, manure pits, things of that sort. The new rule basically restricts almost any confined space environment like that. Another item that's gotten a lot of attention and a lot of discussion are the restrictions on livestock operations. And we can divide these up into a couple of classifications. Number one, the new regulation would say that kids under the age of 16 couldn't work in a confined space with animals. So things like a pen, a farrowing crate, things of that sort, but also that they couldn't work in anything like a feed yard, a livestock auction, or something like that. Basically a marketing place for livestock. The other thing is that currently there are a pretty strict set of livestock activities that kids under the age of 16 can't perform, basically being in the same pen as male breeding stock or being around a mama with her babies present. The new rule would keep that, but would also say there are a lot more specific activities, things like branding, vaccination, helping with breeding activities, any sort of thing like that where the animals might be agitated or startled, all of that would be off limits under the proposed rule.
Okay. Now, we're going to put the entire proposal up on our website if folks want to review that. But if they do review it, they have something they want to say, what kind of action can folks take?
Well, the comment period for the rule has already officially closed. That closed in November of 2011. But there are still things that you can do. If you feel strongly about the rule, you can still let your congressman or your senator know at the federal level, because remember, this is a federal regulation. Now, if you're going to make comments to them, help them make your case by providing safety data or studies that back up your point, because the Department of Labor doesn't get to consider economic impacts. Their sole consideration with these rules is worker safety. So you can't really say it would make my farm more expensive to follow. What you got to say is, I can prove the farm could operate safely even if we didn't follow this rule, if you want to make a change. So
safety is the key there.
Absolutely.
All right. And if folks want to take a look at that proposal, it is on our website, sunup.okstate.edu, along with a sample of the I-9 form we discussed earlier.